Elizabeth Taylor was 9 years old when her mother told her the rule that would control her entire life. If you cry, nobody will love you. So Elizabeth stopped crying. For 70 years. This is the story of the mother who made her a star, and broke her heart. The makeup artist leaned in close. "Miss Taylor, are you ready?" Elizabeth nodded. She was 9 years old. Her first day on a real movie set. National Velvet. The role that would make her a star. But Elizabeth wasn't thinking about the movie. She was thinking about what her mother had said that morning. "Remember, Elizabeth. No crying. Ever. If you cry, they won't love you. And if they don't love you, we lose everything." Elizabeth had nodded. She understood. Crying was weakness. And Elizabeth Taylor wasn't allowed to be weak. The director called action. Elizabeth smiled. The camera rolled. And a star was born. But a little girl disappeared. What Elizabeth didn't know that day was that her mother had been planning this moment since before Elizabeth was even born. Because Sara Taylor had dreams. And Elizabeth was going to make them come true. Sara Taylor had wanted to be a star. She'd been beautiful once. A beauty queen in Kansas. Men had called her stunning. Photographers had wanted her picture. But Sara never made it. She married Francis Taylor instead. Had 2 children. Moved to London. Became a mother. Became ordinary. And Sara hated being ordinary. So when Elizabeth was born in 1932, Sara saw her second chance. This baby, with those strange violet eyes, that perfect face, this baby could be what Sara never was. Famous. Adored. Unforgettable. By the time Elizabeth was 3 years old, Sara had already enrolled her in dance classes. By 4, Elizabeth was performing. By 7, Sara had moved the family to Los Angeles. Because Hollywood was where stars were made. And Sara Taylor was going to make one. Elizabeth's father, Francis, didn't want this life for his daughter. "She's just a child, Sara. Let her be a child." But Sara didn't listen. "She's not just a child, Francis. She's special. And I'm not going to let her waste that." Francis tried to protect Elizabeth. He'd take her to the park. Buy her ice cream. Let her play. But Sara always found out. And Sara always stopped it. "You're spoiling her, Francis. Stars don't play in parks. Stars work." So Elizabeth worked. At 8 years old, Elizabeth Taylor had already done more auditions than most adults. She'd been rejected dozens of times. Too young. Too short. Wrong look. But Sara never gave up. Because giving up meant Sara's dreams died. And Sara wasn't ready to let her dreams die. Then came the audition for National Velvet. Elizabeth was 9. Small for her age. The studio said she was too short to play the lead. Sara refused to accept that. For 4 months, Sara put Elizabeth on a special diet. Made her hang from bars to stretch her spine. Measured her every week. And it worked. Elizabeth grew 3 inches. She got the role. The morning of the first day of shooting, Sara sat Elizabeth down. "Today is the most important day of your life," Sara said. "Everything we've worked for comes down to this. Do you understand?" Elizabeth nodded. "You cannot cry," Sara continued. "Not when you're tired. Not when you're scared. Not ever. Because if the director sees you cry, he'll think you're weak. And weak girls don't become stars." "But what if I feel sad?" Elizabeth asked. Sara's face hardened. "Then you smile anyway. Because nobody loves a girl who cries. Nobody wants to watch a girl who can't control herself." Elizabeth looked down at her hands. They were small. Childish. "What if I can't stop the tears?" Sara leaned in close. Her voice was cold. "Then you think about what happens if you fail. You think about how we lose everything. You think about how disappointed I'll be. And then the tears will stop." Elizabeth never forgot that conversation. Years later, she would say it was the moment she learned to bury her feelings so deep that even she couldn't find them. And Elizabeth did exactly what her mother asked. She became a perfect actress. But the price she paid was her childhood. On set, Elizabeth was magic. She never complained. Never cried. Never caused problems. The director loved her. The crew adored her. Elizabeth Taylor, at 9 years old, was already a professional. But at night, alone in her room, Elizabeth would lie in bed and feel nothing. She wanted to cry. She wanted to scream. She wanted to run away. But she couldn't. Because if she cried, her mother wouldn't love her. And Elizabeth needed her mother to love her. So she taught herself to smile when she wanted to scream. To laugh when she wanted to cry. To perform even when the cameras weren't rolling. Because that's what stars did. And Elizabeth Taylor was going to be a star. National Velvet was a massive success. Elizabeth became famous overnight. At 12 years old, she was one of the biggest child stars in Hollywood. And Sara was finally living her dream. She went to every premiere. Every party. Every interview. But Sara never went as Sara Taylor, former beauty queen. She went as Sara Taylor, Elizabeth Taylor's mother. And that was enough for her. But it wasn't enough for Elizabeth. At 13, Elizabeth tried to talk to her mother about school. "Mother, the other girls don't like me. They say I'm different. They say I think I'm better than them." Sara waved her hand dismissively. "You are better than them, Elizabeth. You're a star. They're jealous. But I just want friends." "You don't need friends," Sara interrupted. "You have your career. That's what matters." Elizabeth went quiet. Because arguing with her mother never worked. At 15, Elizabeth fell in love for the first time. A boy from the studio. He was kind. He made her laugh. For the first time in her life, Elizabeth felt like a normal teenager. But when Sara found out, she ended it immediately. "You're not here to fall in love with boys, Elizabeth. You're here to work. Love is a distraction." "But mother, No." Sara's voice was final. "You will not waste your time on some nobody. You are Elizabeth Taylor. You will marry someone important. Someone who elevates your status." And that's exactly what happened. At 17, Elizabeth became engaged to Conrad Hilton Jr., the hotel heir. Rich. Powerful. Important. Sara approved immediately. "This is perfect, Elizabeth. You'll be Mrs. Conrad Hilton." Can you imagine? Elizabeth didn't want to imagine. Because she didn't love Conrad. But Sara had already planned the wedding. The night before the wedding, Elizabeth sat in her room, staring at her reflection. She wanted to run. She wanted to scream. She wanted to tell her mother, "I don't want this." But she couldn't. Because disappointing her mother was worse than marrying the wrong man. So Elizabeth Taylor got married at 18 years old. And the marriage was a disaster. Conrad drank. He was cruel. He hit her. Elizabeth tried to tell her mother. "Mother, Conrad, he hurts me." Sara frowned. "Don't be dramatic, Elizabeth. All marriages have difficulties. You'll work through it." "But mother, he..." "Enough." Sara stood up. "You are Mrs. Conrad Hilton now. You have a reputation to protect. So you will smile. You will be gracious. And you will make this marriage work." Elizabeth never brought it up again. Because she'd learned long ago, her mother cared more about Elizabeth Taylor the star than Elizabeth the person. The marriage lasted 8 months. When Elizabeth finally filed for divorce, Sara was furious. "Do you know how this makes us look?" Sara demanded. "Do you know what people will say?" "I don't care what people say," Elizabeth said quietly. "He was hurting me." "You're being weak," Sara said. "I raised you to be stronger than this." And that word, weak, hit Elizabeth like a punch. Because that's what her mother had always feared. That Elizabeth would be weak. That she would cry. That she would fail. And in Sara's eyes, divorce was failure. But here's what Sara Taylor never understood. The daughter she created was slowly dying inside. And nobody noticed until it was too late. Elizabeth married again. And again. And again. 7 marriages. 7 attempts to find the love her mother never gave her. Mike Todd was the only one who came close. He treated Elizabeth like a person, not a star. He made her laugh. He made her feel safe. But when Mike died in that plane crash, Elizabeth's world collapsed. At the funeral, Sara approached her. Elizabeth was standing by the grave, staring at the coffin. "Elizabeth," Sara said softly. "You need to pull yourself together. People are watching." Elizabeth turned to her mother. "My husband just died. I know, darling. But you can't fall apart. Not in public." And there it was again. The rule. Don't cry. Don't show weakness. Don't be human. Elizabeth walked away from her mother that day. And something inside her broke. Because she realized, her mother would never let her grieve. Never let her feel. Never let her be anything other than Elizabeth Taylor, the star. Years passed. Elizabeth married Richard Burton. Divorced him. Married him again. Divorced him again. Sara watched from the sidelines, always judging. Always disappointed. "You're making a fool of yourself, Elizabeth. You're too old for this behavior, Elizabeth. You're embarrassing the family, Elizabeth." But Elizabeth stopped listening. Because she'd finally learned something her mother never taught her. It was okay to be broken. It was okay to fail. It was okay to cry. Even if nobody loved her for it. And then, in 1994, Sara Taylor died at 99 years old. And Elizabeth finally allowed herself to feel everything she'd been hiding for 70 years. The phone call came at 3 in the morning. "Miss Taylor, your mother has passed." Elizabeth hung up the phone. Sat on the edge of her bed. Stared at the wall. She should cry, she thought. That's what people do when their mother dies. But the tears wouldn't come. Because Elizabeth Taylor had learned too well. She'd buried her emotions so deep that even grief couldn't reach them. At the funeral, Elizabeth stood by the coffin. Dry-eyed. Composed. Perfect. People whispered. "She's so strong. So dignified." But Elizabeth wasn't strong. She was numb. It wasn't until 3 days later, alone in her mother's house, sorting through her things, that Elizabeth finally broke. She was in her mother's closet when she found an old photo album. Inside were pictures of herself as a child. Elizabeth at 3, dancing. Elizabeth at 5, in her first costume. Elizabeth at 7, smiling for the camera. But in every picture, Elizabeth's eyes looked empty. Elizabeth stared at those photos. At the little girl who never got to be a little girl. And finally, she cried. She cried for the childhood she never had. For the mother who never saw her. For the 70 years she spent pretending to be someone she wasn't. She cried until there were no tears left. And when she was done, Elizabeth whispered to the empty room. "I forgive you, Mother. But I also forgive myself. For not being the daughter you wanted. For being human instead of perfect." Elizabeth Taylor lived another 17 years after her mother died. And in those 17 years, she finally learned to cry. After Sara's death, something changed in Elizabeth. She stopped caring what people thought. She stopped trying to be perfect. She stopped smiling when she wanted to scream. In interviews, she was honest. Brutally honest. "My mother loved Elizabeth Taylor the star. But she never knew Elizabeth the person. I spent my whole life trying to make her proud. And I never succeeded. Because nothing I did was ever enough. She taught me that crying was weakness. But you know what? Crying is human. And I'm finally okay with being human." People were shocked. Elizabeth Taylor, the icon, the legend, was admitting vulnerability. But Elizabeth didn't care anymore. She cried in public. She talked about her pain. She let people see her messy, complicated, imperfect self. And something miraculous happened. People loved her more. Because the world didn't need another perfect star. The world needed someone real. In her final years, Elizabeth worked on her AIDS activism. She raised millions of dollars. She fought for people who had no voice. And when people asked why she cared so much, Elizabeth said, "Because I know what it's like to be invisible. I know what it's like to have people see a version of you that isn't real. And I won't let that happen to anyone else." Elizabeth Taylor died on March 23, 2011, at 79 years old. At her funeral, her children spoke about the mother they knew. Not Elizabeth Taylor the star. But Elizabeth. The woman. The mother. The friend. And they talked about how, in her final years, she'd finally found peace. She learned to cry, her daughter said. And that made her free. Sara Taylor had raised a star. But in the end, Elizabeth Taylor became something more important. She became herself. After the funeral, Elizabeth's son found something in her belongings. A letter. Addressed to Sara Taylor. Written by Elizabeth in 1994, right after Sara died. The envelope had never been opened. Never sent. He unfolded the letter. Read the first line. And understood his mother in a way he never had before. The letter began. Dear Mother, I'm writing this because I never had the courage to say it to your face.